Hello again everybody, continuing on with my theme of events from the history of the early Christian church. Amongst the early Christian intellectuals, particularly in the 2nd century AD, there was a good deal of sympathy for the Stoic philosophy, with its focus on living a life of virtue, moral virtue, and accepting what life dealt out. One of its most famous exponents was the philosopher Emperor Marcus Aurelius. He's the one who was smothered to death at the beginning of the film Gladiator. This confluence of ideas, however, between Christianity and Stoic philosophy was no help at all when the churches around the empire endured persecution in the year 177 AD. The Christian historian Eusebius, writing around 100 years later, records what happened in Gaul, specifically the towns of Lugdunum, Lyons and Vienna, now Vienne. A bishop of Lyons at the time was Irenaeus, another important figure in the history of the church. He had gone to Rome at this point, perhaps to seek help from the Roman Church in the face of a local persecution which was already happening. Now this implies that this was not a centralised persecution, but it was a persecution organised by locals against locals. And this involved Christians being banned from marketplaces and baths and other public places. Those who did appear were mocked and beaten and robbed by the mob. Sounds uncomfortably like the mob violence at any time in history. The Nazis in Germany, pogroms in 19th century Russia, racist lynch mobs in the southern states of the USA. With the connivance of weak government in Gaul, and the weak government anywhere in the face of mob violence, it shows why we should not assume that the voice of the mob is a necessary part of democracy. So in Lyons there were arrests and show trials and punishments, and here is a little extract of what went on. Those who at the time of the first arrest recanted were also kept in prison and shared in the dangers, and in this crisis their denial brought them no advantage. Those who confessed what they were imprisoned as Christians and no other charge was brought against them, but the others were then confined as murderers and abominable wretches and punished twice as much as the rest. Because the martyrs went to their death joyfully, but the renegades looked mean and downcast, they were execrated as murderers. Maturus and Sanctus and Bandana and Attalus were publicly brought to the beasts as a spectacle for the savage and impious populace. For the day the beast fights was granted on purpose for our folk. Maturus and Sanctus again went through every torture in the amphitheatre as if they had previously suffered nothing at all. They again endured the lashings that are usual there and the violence of the beasts, and all that the frenzied mob shouted for and urged from every side. Above all, the iron chair on which their bodies were broiled and exhaled a sacrificial odour. Not even so did they cease, but were all the more maddened, wanting to overcome their endurance. Yet even so they heard nothing from Sanctus but the words with which he had habitually confessed from the beginning. So these, though their souls long endured through a great conflict, were finally sacrificed in the course of that day, and instead of all the variety of single combats, were in themselves a spectacle to the world. Bandana was hung upon a cross and exposed as prey to the onslaught of beasts. At that time none of the beasts touched her, so she was taken down from the cross, returned to the prison kept for other games. Attalus too was greatly in demand by the crowd, for he was a man of note. He was led round the amphitheatre, and a placard preceded him on which was written in Latin, "This is Attalus the Christian." Though the people were inflamed with anger against him, the governor, on learning that he was a Roman citizen, ordered him to be taken back along with the rest of those in prison, about whom he'd sent a dispatch to Caesar, and he was awaiting his decision. So problems again were as the governor endured with or came across with St. Paul on people who were Roman citizens having better legal rights than those who didn't. Now, as well as this, there was a further insult added in the mob violence, and this was with insults to the bodies of the dead. Now this may have had its origin in the notion of the Christians joining together to form burial clubs and to deny that, but also the belief in pagan religion that proper burial was necessary in order for the soul to reach the underworld. This is what happened with that. But not even so were their frenzy and their savagery against the saints satisfied. Wild and barbarous tribes, their feelings stirred up by a wild beast, could not be easily checked, and their violence began in another way of their own against the bodies. They used to throw to the dogs those who died in prison, and were kept careful watch by night and day, lest any should receive proper burial from us. Then they also displayed what was left from the beasts and the fire, some mangled, some burnt to a cinder, and the heads of the rest with their severed bodies, and in the same way kept them unburied under military guard for several days. Some were enraged and gnashed their teeth at them, seeking to exact some further punishment from them. Others were mocked and taunted at the same time, extolling their own idols and attributing to them the vengeance that had befallen these. The more moderate, who were thought to sympathize to some extent, were full of reproaches, saying, "Where's their God? And how did the religion avail them which they chose, even in preference to their own life?" Such were their different attitudes. On our part there was great grief because we couldn't bury the bodies. Night didn't help us in this, nor could money bribe nor entreaties win over, for they kept watch in every way, as if it would be a great gain if they didn't obtain burial. The bodies of the martyrs were put on show in every way and exposed to the open air for 6 days. Then they were burnt and reduced to ashes by the impious and swept down into the river Rhone, which flows past close by, so that not even a relic of them might still appear above ground. They did this as if they had the power to overcome God and deprive them of resurrection, in order that, as they said, they may not have even a hope of resurrection, trusting in which they introduce to us a new and foreign religion and despise sufferings, coming to death readily and with joy. Now let us see whether they will rise again, and whether their God can help them now and deliver them out of our hands. Well, true savagery of the mob, willing even to insult the bodies of the dead. Now, I think this is an important incident in history, because as well as its place as a record of what actually happened in 177 AD in that place, I always thought it, since I first read this, I've always thought it carries an important warning to us all now. Irrational hatred of groups, whether because of their creed or their colour or their national origin, leads to the most dehumanising effect on the perpetrators of those atrocities. Secondly, weak governments cave in to this mob rule in the name of the will of the people, when tomorrow the will of the people may very well be totally different. And we must all remind ourselves of the errors of our past to guard against them being the errors of our present.